Okay, just give me a moment. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hello, and thank you very much for the introduction. It really is a big honour to be here today to open this very important conference. I've been a fan of the Civics of Tech group for some time now, and I really appreciate the kind of breadth of work taking place, as well as the very sort of practical, hands-on approach that many of the resources take to dealing with these very complex and messy kinds of digital issues that are emerging from EdTech. But before I begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking to you tonight, the Wadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. They are the traditional owners of the area that is called Perth today, but I am from Melbourne on the other side of the continent, and most of my research takes place there. So I also want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and to both groups I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I want to acknowledge that the lands that we now call Australia have long been places of teaching, learning and research. We have a lot to learn from the Indigenous perspectives and knowledge, and that could be of real use to us in the digital and educational issues that we face. Now, as a backdrop today, to my talk today, I want to start with the Human Rights Watch report from last year. Because in many respects, it forms the kind of context to a lot of what I want to talk to you about today. And in this report, they reviewed the privacy of many of the EdTech products on the market that took off during the pandemic. Now, many of you would have heard of this report and you've possibly even read it, but I think it's worth recounting some of the headline findings. So of the 164 EdTech products reviewed, 146 or 89% of these appeared to engage in data practices that put children's rights at risk, contributed to undermining them, or actively infringed on these rights. Now, these products monitored or had the capacity to monitor children, in most cases secretly and without the consent of children or their parents and guardians. In many cases, they were harvesting data on who these children are, where they are, what educational institution they attend, who their family, friends and guardians are, and what kind of devices their families could afford for them to use, which obviously gives a great insight into their socioeconomic status. Now, we're not talking about obscure apps and platforms, but platforms like Education Perfect, Khan Academy and Dropbox were all actively sharing data with Facebook. Now, Google did not feature well. Of the 164 EdTech products examined by the Human Rights Watch, 132 products, or 80% of these, were found to have tracking technologies embedded, which were built by Google. Now, this is in addition to the Google products already in schools, and we know Google is making huge inroads in countries like Brazil, India, and Africa through hardware like Chromebooks and its Google for Education suite of products. Now, they are partnering with companies and institutions in increasingly complex ways to expand their foothold in education. Now, often Google's push into schools is actually being facilitated by departments and ministries of education. For example, in my own state of Victoria, the Department of Education and Training offer Google to government schools on what's called the tenant or a shared licence. Now, when talking to staff at the DET, I was told that Google does not allow them to see any of the data that Google actually collects from students and schools. So they are essentially reduced to a kind of conduit for Google into our school and education system. In a sense, the Department of Education is acting as a shortcut into the huge swathes of data that could provide some interesting insights into teaching and learning at scale. The Human Rights Report really put digital privacy on the map for many people in education research and also in mainstream media. Now, a little closer to your home, a report came out last year from the Centre for Democracy and Technology, and that found that not only is the main student privacy law that protects student data, or the Federal Educational Rights and Privacy Act, not only are they no longer legally sufficient for protecting student privacy, but also there is a lack of staff and resourcing in local educational agencies to assess, so that really what they found was that 95% of security incidents are at least partially the result of human error, underscoring the importance of allocating and really building staff capacity to understand and identify these issues. So for now, it seems that EdTech is making it into schools and education institutions without sufficient checks and balances taking place. And what this ultimately means is that just by going to school to learn, children's digital privacy is violated, and therefore their digital rights are being jeopardised. And we tend to think of this as an issue without really thinking about what's at stake. But I really want to underscore that there is a lot at stake, and we should be concerned. First of all, privacy is a human right. Now, this right encompasses the freedom from intrusion into our private lives, the right to control information about ourselves, and the right to a space in which we can freely express our identities and have them recognised by others. Privacy is also about autonomy and control over one's life. Now, this is particularly important for children as they are entitled to special protections that provide them with the space to grow, play, and experiment with who they are. Privacy is also vital to ensuring safety, agency, and dignity. In education, privacy really provides children and young people with the space to develop their personalities and abilities. So for children who are survivors of abuse, for example, privacy means the ability to live freely without exposure of where they live, play, and go to school. Or for lesbian, gay, and transgender students, privacy could mean the difference between life-saving information and being sent to jail or something much worse. At the end of the day, privacy is not and should never be considered a luxury. It is a right. And for vulnerable and marginalised children and young people, the stakes are even higher. Now, protecting this right sits at much of what I research and is a recurring theme within some of the ideas I want to share with you today. I mean, in particular, I'm interested in whether young people and teachers and staffs in school, whether they are concerned by these issues. Are they aware of them? How are EdTech products changing teaching and learning? Who owns the data? Where does the data go? And what does this mean for our education systems? These questions and the difficulty in answering them really underscore the importance of critical digital literacies for teachers, administrators, and students today. Working with teachers and students helps us identify what makes an actual difference when it comes to not only protecting our digital privacy, but also a whole host of issues such as how they are reshaping teaching and learning, how they are increasing teacher and parent labour, and the intensification and accountability measures that are also increasing in schools. Indeed, in many ways, digital privacy is just the tip of the iceberg if we think about the multitude of ways in which education and learning are changing through EdTech products. And indeed, it is this broader picture of the iceberg underneath, if you will, that I want to focus on today. So today, what I want to do is, first, take you on a bit of a journey and look at one type of EdTech that is really on the rise in which is called student activity monitoring software, or what the Electronic Frontiers Foundation simply calls spyware. Closely examining this example, we can really explore what is gained and lost with some types of EdTech. Now, it really underscores how now, more than ever, critical digital literacies are essential to teachers and students. And from my recent work, student activity monitoring software is not just damaging in and of itself, but what I want to put to you today is that it actually changes what it means to be digitally literate and critical. And I think that's a real concern. Second, I want to explore the substantive question underpinning this presentation, that is, are digital literacies becoming a kind of soft power for educational governance? Do student activity monitoring software, or SAMs, change or threaten what it means to be digitally literate or critical? And then in the last part of the talk, I want to introduce a framework to help us organise a response to these very complex and difficult problems. Now, the manifesto outlines 4 key roles for educators and adults to occupy when thinking about whether or not to engage with a piece of EdTech software. And I want to make the case that teachers and educators at all levels of education, in fact, any adult really, plays a really key role in driving this critical conversation and advocating for change. So, let me introduce you to one example of a student activity monitoring software, which I'll call StudyScreen. Now, many of you might have heard of software like StudyScreen, and StudyScreen is just one example of many new EdTech products that are now on the market, which enable teachers to monitor their students' laptops in real time. Now, others include Dino, GoGuardian, and Securely. Now, while such invasive software might have seemed almost unfathomable 12 years ago, or 10 years ago, or even 6 years ago, it is now really on the rise in our schools. Now, StudyScreen and companies like it represent a category of software products that monitor, scan, and filter student and teachers' online interactions, and will supposedly help students that are at risk, monitor students' learning, empower teachers, and keep students safe, engaged, and well. Now, despite the hype, there's a lot to be concerned by, and looking at how it is used in school and the ways it reshapes classroom practice provide us with detailed evidence of this. So schools and teachers can play a powerful role in initiating critical conversations in the community. However, it is my argument that technologies like StudyScreen are actually making this critical approach just much more difficult. So I've recently finished a 3-year study with Neil Selwyn and Bronwyn Cumbo investigating data in schools. And in brief, we worked with 3 schools over a period of a couple of years to really understand how they use data, the kinds of data they collected, and to help them use data better. Now, this is the project website and blog. So if anyone is interested, the address is there at the bottom. But one of the schools that we were working with introduced StudyScreen during this time. And today I want to share with you how and why this tech was procured, because I think that's really important, and the ways that it was actually experienced and understood by teachers and students, in the hope that we might find out how and where we can really intercede in the uptake of these technologies. After all, my real goal in doing this work and in talking to you today is to find ways we can disrupt and potentially change what can appear to be a seamless and unquestioning uptake of these types of technologies in schools. So, what is StudyScreen? Well, StudyScreen is an automated monitoring system that provides teachers with live updates of students' laptop activities. The program supervises learning by algorithmically calculating whether the student is engaged in educational on-task work through a machine learning model of approved on-task resources, or whether they are off-task, and that is using on a website that is considered to be an off-task resource. Now, class data can be aggregated via a real-time live screen dashboard on the teacher's device. And this is what you can see here on the left. This displays each student's current state of engagement using traffic light colours descending from green to orange to red. Now, StudyScreen is also able to monitor how often students switch between on and off-task activities, as well as the number of keystrokes and mouse clicks. Now, this former metric is represented as a distractibility index for the teacher, and school administrators can also review recordings of aggregated data from past lessons with StudyScreen's learning flow feature, representing how class laptop use varies over the course of a single lesson or a whole day, a week, or even an entire term. Now, StudyScreen's monitoring of students and teachers and the punishment that comes with being off task promotes a really behaviourist approach to learning, where off-task activities are punished and on-task activities are rewarded. So the sales pitch is help students stay on task, supports teachers in monitoring and redirecting students, which of course was really important also to some teachers thought during the pandemic, and enabled teachers to reflect on which of their lessons were just really boring. But what's the reality? So let's go back to the beginning, and we were interested in, I guess, trying to really understand why the school introduced this software in the first place and what was the overarching goal of it. Now, the Director of Teaching and Learning at the school, who I'll call Tom, told us that Study Screen was introduced to address teachers' concerns over student laptop use. Now, several teachers felt that the students could go off task very easily when they were using their laptop, and this was an ongoing impediment to their learning. Study Screen was introduced by Director Tom and the Dean of Data, who I'll call Chris. These are obviously pseudonyms, and both were very deliberate in how they framed the presentation, explaining that the purpose was not to show teachers how to press buttons, but rather so they may come away from these sessions wanting to get to learn about these systems, to see a reason why you might want to get to use them. So in keeping with this, the presentation really felt like a bit of a sales pitch, complete with a dramatic reveal of the Study Screen dashboard on the main screen of the auditorium. But what do teachers think about Study Screen? Well, some teachers had not noticed students even going off task and didn't really register it as a problem. For example, one teacher, Kath, explained, "I didn't know I wanted it until I got it." And in this way, Study Screen simultaneously introduces the problem and solves it all in one. And several teachers were just confused, like Rick, a year level coordinator at the school, felt confused by how Study Screen worked and really questioned its accuracy. As he says, "I'm confused as to what actually it is showing, even when they're on task." But probably the most talked about issue amongst teachers was the fact that it just wasn't accurate. Study Screen would often flag students as off task when they were actually on task. For example, if students were asked to research a topic and happened to be watching a clip about it on YouTube, Study Screen would label them off task. Indeed, Director of Teaching and Learning, Tom, stressed in his introduction the importance of being critical and not to blindly trust the colours, as he put it. However, resolving this issue relied on teachers individually checking with the student, the website, and then potentially labelling it as an on-task resource. Now, not all teachers felt that this was an appropriate solution to kind of making the software work. As John said, the problem is it's relying on teachers to feed the algorithm, with us indicating whether or not it's an approved site, and the lack of training, I suppose, education around how to do that, and obviously on top of normal requirements for a teacher. Indeed, it was clear that Study Screen required additional digital literacies for teachers and an expansion of classroom practices to those normally used throughout the school day in order to really investigate and rectify the perceptions that were being developed about a particular student. Another issue was that while teachers could watch their students, they were well aware of the fact that they themselves could also be watched. So when Study Screen was introduced, Tom went to great lengths to explain that it would not be used to monitor or judge teachers. As he says, so this will not be used to evaluate, criticise or praise your teaching, but instead it's a tool for you to use. However, later in the same presentation, Tom used the example of being bewildered by his Study Screen results from one class and then added, "I thought I was a good teacher until I saw this. But then I realised I was on a retreat that week and my students were with a relief teacher." But what he didn't seem to realise that this was a form of teacher judgment and it was already taking place and he was judging himself. Later in interviews, when asked whether Study Screen could be used to judge teacher performance, one teacher, John, answered, "Yeah, I think there's potential for that. And even like, I know part of me thinks even framing it like we're not looking, but we can, is nudging you to think that we are, even if that wasn't the intention. It is therefore inevitable that a program like Study Screen is strongly shaping of teachers' practices." So what did the students think? Some students were pretty happy about the introduction of Study Screen because if you're at school, you're supposed to be doing work. And if you're not doing work, then there should be consequences. Others felt it should be used differentially. So some students could be trusted, but the good students should be. Now you can see how this technology might be encouraging students to look more closely at what others in the class were doing and then hoping for consequences. And we might ask, what does this actually do for classroom camaraderie and interpersonal relationships between the students themselves? But many felt that Study Screen was an invasion of their privacy, and this led to trust issues with teachers and even this creeping sense of betrayal. Now, as one student explains, it felt like when you get along with the teacher, you think the teacher trusts you and stuff like that, but really they don't trust you because they're looking at your history and looking at what you're going on and when you're going on it. Another student said Study Screen made them feel very uncomfortable and even unsafe. Now, of course, several students had developed surreptitious digital literacies and workarounds to try and escape the watchful gaze of Study Screen. One tactic, which was particularly effective during lockdown, was using another device such as a phone for off-task activities. And another tactic involved working out when the teacher was checking Study Screen and having two screens going open on their browser and being able to switch between. Now, I'm not sure whether these actually worked, but the students seem to think that they did. So what does this case tell us about digital literacies and the use of contemporary ed tech in schools? Now, we investigated the rollout and use of just one program, and in doing so, highlighted how notions of digital literacy become new forms of surveillance, monitoring, and accountability that reshape relations between teachers, students, and school leaders. Now, it's my argument that the discourse that surrounds these technologies are clearly significant in shaping the digital literacies and practices of different actors in the school. But I just want to try to summarise to see what we can take away from this Study Screen example. And the first and rather obvious point is that teachers and students often have very little choice in the platforms they use. And if a teacher chose not to use it, they would have been viewed in a particular way, and often in not a very favourable light. So they might have been viewed as a Luddite, or as if they had something to hide, or not caring of their students. And the students really didn't have a lot of say in the matter. Also evident is that those at the school facilitating use of these types of programs have an interest in teachers taking it up and making it work. And this is not only because they believe in the potential of the technology to streamline activities and make things more efficient, but also to justify their choice and the school's purchase of the software. Now, with this in mind, we might ask, are school leaders genuinely able to see this critically? And if they can see it critically, are they able to change or get rid of something that is not living up to expectations? Are they able to break the subscription or contract that the tech company has set? Third, while teachers' practices have long been monitored by school leaders, these quite invasive monitoring and filtering platforms really pave the way for new modes of surveillance via what is emerging as a kind of new soft power. Now, my colleague at Monash, Selena Nemerin, describes the datafied platforms in schools as rhizomatic structures of surveillance. As she explains, top-down institutional methods of surveillance still remain, but increased connectivity leads to an increasing number of watchtowers within the network, watchtowers that are both within and beyond the school itself, as we get more centralised kind of accountability measures through our education systems. And perhaps more powerfully, the teachers were being encouraged to watch themselves, monitoring their performance across days and classes. Now, interpreting these kinds of technologies accurately and effectively also led to increased labour for teachers and an increased lack of trust from students toward their teachers. Now, what additional relational and or emotional work is required to make up for this, to bridge this kind of gap that's looming? And how does this change the way students just feel about being at school and with the teachers? Finally, tying all this together, school-based digital literacies appear to be being shaped through these kinds of platforms. To be digitally literate with Study Screen, teachers had to understand its data dashboard, as well as reinterpreting student behaviours in light of these dashboard visualisations. So their notions of what it means to be digitally literate were at once expanded, but also contracted as it was dictated along the lines of the platform. So to use Study Screen properly meant really getting on board with how it approached teaching, learning, and assessment. So one of our key takeaways from this study is that introducing the software cannot take place without the lubricant of digital literacies, without a conceptualization of how reading, writing, and understanding take place through, about, and around the software. And this is essentially where I want to start this more theoretical discussion by thinking about this key question. Are digital literacies becoming a soft power for educational governance? How do we reclaim digital literacies to ensure that they are not co-opted by edtech companies to enable the seamless flow of data into and out of our schools? How do teachers maintain criticality when they are continually told to get on board with whatever software monitoring or learning management program they are being asked to use? They are in a very difficult position. Now, if digital literacy is defined and developed in relation to different digital platforms and apps in schools, and if the platforms and apps in schools are increasingly designed to monitor and surveil and control staff or to optimize the kind of flow of data into commercial networks, then that is really shaping how we think about digital literacies. And it's become obviously then a powerful way to govern both teachers and students in schools. Now, if we broaden our focus away from study screen, we can see this is already taking place in more organised and obvious way at scale with companies like Meta and Google, which have released digital literacies and digital skills programs. Now, on the one hand, I sort of want to say, well done, that they're actually thinking about this. But we know that Google has a well-established and rapidly expanding professional development program for teachers as well. Indeed, their Google certified program is really beginning to fill the gap in economically developing nations where teacher training and professional development is often under-resourced. So I want to change the focus a little to have a think about critical digital literacies that we, our teachers and students and education bureaucrats really need in contemporary society. Ultimately, what can we do about this? So a productive way forward may be that digital literacies are conceptualised and developed, at least in part, separate to the educational platforms and apps that are in our schools. Now, it is my argument that some form of critical distance from the edtech platforms in schools is essential for reclaiming what digital literacy is and what it should be in the future. These literacies might be more focused on the ideologies that underpin the platform and the practices and behaviours it inculcates. These literacies are not necessarily gleaned through use, but by stepping back from the interface and considering how the platform operates, who owns it, and what behaviours and dispositions it promotes. Now, I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs, as I think the civics of tech community are perhaps one of the best at providing practical ways for teachers and educators to think about some of the difficult issues and associated with using digital technologies in schools, or digital technologies generally. But what I want to offer today is a way of organising our responses to this. And in doing so, really have a think about the different roles that educators, and really any educator that is working with EdTech, how they can disrupt, resist, rework EdTech or any technology really. Now, one-off programs here and there are obviously very useful, but the challenges that are now emerging from EdTech require a really organised suite of responses that scaffold people toward critical and questioning disposition. So how can we organise our thoughts and take a deliberate, comprehensive approach to critique EdTech to ensure our young people genuinely benefit from it? There are so many activities and approaches, but I want to finish the talk today by outlining what educators and practitioners who work with young people can do, and I base this around 4 dimensions of practice. Now, there's a lot of information and professional development about how to use digital technologies to engage young people in their learning. I mean, that is a huge kind of industry unto itself. But the threats to young people's digital rights really require us not just to be researching these platforms so we understand the risks and opportunities we are introducing ourselves and our students to when we use them. But we also need to educate young people about the challenges presented by digital platforms. We also need to become activists who resist using these pernicious technologies and advocate for our students' rights to educational providers and government bureaucrats who really know no different. Finally, we need to get creative to reimagine and redesign how EdTech could be done better. None of these are easy, but I think we need to start on this journey. So first, it is essential that we research how digital platforms operate, specifically the ways in which they are governed, how they make their money, and the kind of difference they make to teachers and students in their everyday learning life. So a good place to start is, of course, the civics of tech, critical questions of technology. And I would argue we need these questions to be asked by educators and adults who work with children and young people. And in particular, it is those in schools and districts who are responsible for procurement who really need to think about these questions. So if we apply these questions to Study Smart, the software monitoring system I analysed earlier, what kinds of answers would we get? Well, in answering question 1, for example, what does society give up for the benefits of the technology? Well, first we could say that the school had to preload the software on a compatible device. So they may be giving up using a particular type of operating system. Second, the teachers give up class time talking to students, as this is replaced by making sense of study screen and its dashboard. And of course, teachers might have seen or felt from the outset that students and teachers are also giving up their privacy. In asking what does the technology need, the answer might be unfettered access to our students' laptops and data. Might be teachers have to have an expanded set of literacies in order to interpret the dashboard. The unintended consequences surfaced when answering question 4 might have explored what it means for a school community when trust between teachers and students and administrators and teachers and schools and departments is eroded. Now, these conversations should have taken place before or not long after Study Screen was installed, as they could have forecast the issues that really emerged through our interviews. Because unfortunately, the full set of consequences really may not be made clear for some time. But there are other tools that are really helpful, which you're all probably aware of. And the first one of these is Terms of Service Didn't Read, which basically summarises all the problematic aspects in terms and conditions agreements, and then grades those websites accordingly. As you can see here, Facebook has been graded E. Now, the second is Blacklight, which is a website privacy inspector. And with Blacklight, you can enter the address of basically any website, and Blacklight will scan it and reveal the specific user tracking technologies. You can see how many ad trackers are found on a site, how many third-party cookies, whether it shares data with Facebook, and whether the website can monitor keystrokes and mouse clicks. Now, these are the results for the Australian, our national broadsheet newspaper. And as you can see, there are an abnormally high number of ad trackers and third-party cookies on this site. But Blacklight also detected the use of a session recorder, which tracks user mouse movements, clicks, taps, scrolls, and even network activity. So there are a range of free tools that we can use and share with educators. And these are not magic bullets, but it's about building awareness and of developing a lot of little critical conversations around these tools so that they create a commonly shared discourse amongst educators and EdTech researchers. Now, part of this also involves educators playing, surprise, an educational role and helping young people find out more about the platforms that they use. Critique does not come naturally for all. It is something that we need to explicitly develop in young people. Now, I've found this Anatomy of Digital platform from Jose van Dijk really helpful in just thinking about the different functions of a platform. They are, as I explained earlier, fueled by data, automated through algorithms and interfaces, formalised through ownership relations and shareholder agreements, driven by business models and governed by user agreements. Now, Van Dijk's anatomy helps to capture the various elements of platforms that we really need to start paying attention to. So my argument is that just as we teach students how essays, poems, films and books are structured, why don't we start teaching them how to critically consider how digital technologies are structured? So starting with the interface, they could analyse the layout, the use of colour, images and texts of their most used platforms, asking critical questions around how these design choices position them as users. They could consider things like, why do so many social media platforms use blue? Why are images given such priority on the page? What do platform metrics tell us about what is valued by the platform? Now, part of this could be developing understandings of how digital content is presented and circulated online, and therefore analysing the function of platform mechanisms, including hashtags, likes, and metrics, progressing to consider more hidden things and complex things, such as the role of algorithms and data. Now, in many instances, my research has revealed that young people already know these things implicitly, but the benefit lies in bringing these out into the open to be discussed and examined collectively. Related to this is providing the time and space for them to critically reflect on their own online practices. Now, as part of the Data Smart Schools project, we developed a set of free resources for educators to use in schools. And so I think this really fits quite nicely into this second dimension of the manifesto. And these are going up online somewhere very soon. So I'll send Dan and Maria a link when we get that sorted, because we really want people to use them. And as you can see here, we covered quite a bit of ground across 4 main areas: know your data, data uses, data privacy, and school data, which was a very interesting area for students to consider. Now, the Civics of Tech website have heaps of other better options. It really doesn't take much to initiate these critical conversations, and these are crucial to shifting dispositions towards the platforms that we use, but they really need to take place in an ongoing way. But in addition to the educational responses, which I've spent a bit of time talking about in the first 2 dimensions, we also need to think about top-down responses. So while we may not be lawyers or politicians, it is really helpful to know the laws that can support us in our quest to protect ours and our children and young people's digital rights. Now, in Australia, the most important of these is the Privacy Act. And while it has really no relevance to you guys in the US, I think as an example, it's quite an interesting one. It was introduced in 1988, and it's currently being reviewed, which really couldn't come soon enough, given that it was introduced 2 years before the CEO of Snapchat was even born. Obviously, media and communication have changed a lot since 1988. So possibly not fit for purpose. But it's not worth me telling you too much more from Australia, as every country and state have completely different laws and processes to ensure schools and organisations are doing their due diligence on EdTech platforms. But we should know these and find out how they can support us in the work that we do, and really take on board the concerns of the Human Rights Watch report that I began this talk with. So by being an activist, I'm not asking adults, researchers and educators to break the law or chain yourself to the gates of Google, but if you want to, knock yourself out. But we do need to raise awareness of these issues and lobby hard to protect our children and our own digital rights. And I take inspiration from Europe, because several countries there, like France and Norway, have banned Microsoft and Google because these companies do not protect children's data. So through the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR, and the consciousness raising a law like this brings, Europe is really starting to lead the way when it comes to resistance of big tech and edtech. So collectivity could in fact be the most powerful weapon at our disposal. After all, if a state or district refuses to endorse a piece of software, then we don't need to worry about the ways in which it breaches data privacy or the new kinds of practices it introduces into the classroom, because it just won't be allowed. Now, as a final point, I want to advocate for educators to be creative in their approach to using digital technology. We do not need to use platforms in the ways that were intended, and indeed we can look to other cultures and practices for inspiration. Now, one creative project which some of you might be aware of is that of Ben Grosser, and he's done some work on a Facebook and Twitter demetricator. And the demetricator is a browser extension that removes all numbers from the social media interface. And demetricator lets us try out social media without the numbers to see what happens when we can no longer judge ourselves, to see really along those metric forms. Now, this disrupts our obsession with the social media metrics, so we can reveal how they are beginning to guide our behaviour, and to ask who most benefits from a system that quantifies our public interactions online. This could be a great little project to do with students, again, to raise those critical questions around the platforms they spend a lot of time on. Now, one project we did a little while ago was the redesigning a chat app called FriendSend. And this was really with the purpose of helping kids understand how their data was being collected and used for commercial processes. Now, not only do we get an insight into the students' understandings about social media and digital data, but through a teacher dashboard, we were able to show them how their personal data was being processed for commercial purposes. And we processed 3 types of data: geolocational, text and image data. And it was interesting to us that the thing which the students were most perplexed and concerned by was the ongoing geolocational tracking that happened through the app. And I've got an image of those red dots on that map there, is my own geolocational tracking while I was using the app. I've written about this quite a bit, so I'm happy to share any of these publications with you if you're interested. Now, as redesigners, I'm not suggesting that educators need to go out and develop and design their own app or, demetricator. But in this spirit, you can repurpose apps or use them differently to the way that was intended. Young people in particular are very good at reworking apps and platforms. So perhaps a workshop on the school tech with the students would be a really great place to start. And a couple of years ago, we worked with secondary students on their school or learning management system profiles and asked them to consider what they would like to be included and who should be able to see them. And even though this was a relatively minor task, this went some way to building a greater sense of agency and control in regard to school-based apps and platforms. So in summing up, to resist the soft power of educational governance, we first need to make sure that in some way digital literacies are separate to the apps and platforms in schools. We need to decide on what is important for kids to know about digital systems. And to this end, I would say there is a knowledge building phase, a critical reflexive phase that really starts from a personal perspective, and then there is a redesign or creative phase. So in bringing together the various activities and ideas to do this, we can conclude by saying these practices are generally collective rather than individual, active rather than passive, exploratory rather than instrumentalist, and creative rather than quantitative. We know EdTech is here to stay. Our education facilities are littered with apps and platforms, and there is a multi-billion-dollar industry dedicated to redesigning new and innovative learning and administrative systems. So while we may not be able to change this situation, we can address some of the challenges that accompany the rise of EdTech, and which I've outlined today. Through research, education, activism, and redesign, we can disrupt, resist, and reinvent the technologies that are often created for us. Thank you.